at the end of this, we have this weird neoliberal, non-managerial capitalism where everyone is meant to be managing according to financial markets, for a lot of which was driven by people presuming that financial markets were the ultimate information processing system, that you could just throw any question and you would get an answer coming from the market about anything that you wanted to do.
So I've got with me the economist Dan Davies, who is the author of the Unaccountability Machine. We're going to talk about that today. Thanks so much for coming, Dan.
Very much for inviting me. I think this is my first time ever on a live stream.
Is it actually? Okay, wow, I'm surprised by that, because your book's been doing pretty well, right? I mean, I would have thought you would have got invited to quite a lot of things.
It's done all right. I've been on podcasts. I've been on so many podcasts. If your computer is started making a funny whining noise, it's probably me on a podcast. This is the first time with the live technology. I'm very impressed.
Yes, yeah. It took me about 3 years before I stopped making stupid mistakes on the live streams. I'll say that, and I'll have made one. But yeah. So this book, I feel it's so. It's very much of the time. I feel like it came along at the right time, and this notion of like accountability, while it's a word we all know and use, right? I think you bring a lot of things together. So I mean, it sort of captures everything from the frustration of trying to change your broadband provider, which I did recently, and like not being able to speak to anyone, right? All the way through to like Trump, right, and like the 2008 financial crisis. So yeah, could you explain like how you bring those things together with this idea of accountability?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing to me was that the Unaccountability Machine was a late change of title. All the time that I was working on this book, I was calling it Decisions Nobody Made, and
okay,
it was. I mean, I've lately been told that Decisions Nobody's Made would be a crap title, and I was very lucky to have changed it. But what it's all about is what I'd call the industrialization of decision making. And that's something that's really gone on in the last 50 years. And it's not been well understood or well analysed at all. So, I mean, I kind of like the idea here is that, like 100 years ago, you might have had a knife and fork, which would have been made in Sheffield by a master cutler. And there would be a human being who would see your cutlery and they'd be able to say, I made that. And obviously, that's just not how the world works anymore. Everything is made by a machine and you have a machine operator, but that's not the same thing as making the things. But increasingly, really, since the Second World War, and at an accelerating rate, as organisations have got more and more complicated, and as the whole system has got more and more complicated, people have built systems and processes and policies. They've implemented some of them into literal computer software, but in general, most of the people who we still think of as managers and decision makers, even up to CEO level, even up to quite high in government level, their daily experience is much more like being the operator of an industrial decision-making machine. They don't kind of feel like they're actually making these decisions. Because they don't feel like they're making the decisions, it's psychologically intolerable to be held responsible for a decision you didn't make. And so they start creating more and more of these systems and attributing a sort of objective reality to them, because that way they can deflect accountability away from themselves into phrases used in the book is an accountability sink, which is just a social arrangement used in order to direct negative emotion and negative feedback into a place where it can be harmlessly accumulated without causing any trouble to any individual manager. Obviously, the very biggest accountability sink we have is the market, which, I'm just looking at you, I'm about 10 or 20 years older than you. So I remember when market decisions, or particularly bond market and foreign exchange market decisions, were things that could be criticized. I remember dimly one of my kind of first adult memories when we got rid of having the idea that the interest rate was something that was managed by a politically elected representative. These things have all been changed. It has made the world change in a really quite complicated way, and it's all just very, very underanalyzed. And in the book I come up with a couple of theories about why it's been so underanalyzed, most of which basically involve blaming Milton Friedman.
That's always a safe bet, isn't it? I mean, one thing I did like about the book, one moment I liked in the book, if you could talk us through this, was how you first thought that you'd solved the problem. And you thought you were going to be really famous, make loads of money, probably be king of the universe or something with your new theory. And then you realized that you were wrong. So could you talk us through that? Because I think that personal revelation is quite an interesting way to understand your theory.
I mean, this was actually kind of horrible, because when I had the book with the decisions nobody made, I had this perfect kind of plan set out. It was all going to be the concept of an accountability sink. Have you noticed how everyone blames things on the computer, or blames them on the market, or blames it on the policy these days? Nobody takes individual accountability for their decisions anymore, and they should, and they're bad people for not doing so. And, we should all kind of criticize everyone for that, and, have a new revolution where more people take accountability for their decisions. And it was a nice, clear book. I think it would have sold well in airports. It would have, but like 1 year into writing this thing, I just got more and more questions. I got some very good questions from a very good editor of Profile Books, by the way, great publishing house. And I just had this kind of attack of intellectual honesty, which is just, professionally disastrous. The book took another 2 years to write, because I was thinking, ended up just go, well, actually, firstly, can you really run a modern industrial society based on individual people having individual responsibility for the decisions they make? And if you could, would you want to? A lot of the time, the reason that there's a policy in place, or that the reason that there's a checklist or a system for making this decision, is that people who had the power to make it and nominally be accountable for doing so kind of abused that power pretty badly in the past. And so actually I started, really revising the entire kind of thesis here and thinking, well, what we've got here when we are talking about accountability sinks is ways in which people manage the fact that their environment is just too complicated for them to make sense of. People start basically, because the world is too complicated to deal with, people create a mental object and start trying to manage that. Or we kind of put arrangements together to create a shared mental object, and we'll make decisions about our simplified mental object, and then we'll hope that those decisions are not too disastrous when they're applied to the real world. And that got me into my kind of current intellectual obsession, Stafford Beer and Management Cybernetics, which is, as far as I can tell, the only time anyone's had a really solid approach at taking a scientific and rigorous attack on the problem of how do you manage overwhelming information flows.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a lot of detail. I think one example that popped into my mind when you were talking about that, like, the sort of bad decision makers versus creating a system to make a decision for you, was like grades. So everyone complains about grades, and it's fair enough. People are, students are graded too much. Everybody knows that it's stressful and all that. But there is evidence. I realized this, that what came before that, which was basically the teacher saying how good you were, was worse. It was worse. It was much more biased, discriminatory. It's who the teacher liked, who looked like the teacher, all that kind of stuff. And now we've got grades, and they've got their problems, but they were designed to solve the problem of what came before, right? So it's just it would be too easy just to say, let's go back to the what was the example you used at the beginning, with somebody who designed a shoe or something, a blacksmith or something? Like, we can't go back to that.
Your artisanal decision making, you just can't do it. And in many cases, you wouldn't want to. It's sort of, which is a lot of the problem, kind of skipping ahead a few chapters here, with the populist right. And the people like the Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, even Silvio Berlusconi, they are, to a large extent, taking people who are overwhelmed by a world that is basically too complex for them to deal with, partly because, government functions which were meant to deal with a lot of that uncertainty and risk for them are failing to do so. And you've got Trump who's just saying, this is all easy. I can make this simple. I can make, the world manageable and comprehensible for you again. And it's a lie, because, to claim you can do that is like saying you can turn back time. It just can't be done, unfortunately. We have to live with the world as it is.
I mean, it's interesting because this book, I guess, is about did it come out about a year ago or something like that?
Earlier this year in the US and in Paperbook, 2 years ago, so before the Trump election, which resulted me saying a few things about Trump in it that might impact on my ability to go to the USA and market it.
Definitely. But it's interesting what he's tried to do now, right? I mean, because, it's difficult when somebody's just obviously a complete moron, but also there's a rationale somewhere there, which is that I think he's doing what you were talking about, right? He's trying to turn back time. He's saying, no, we're going to bring everything under the control of the American people with these tariffs, with whatever political gestures he's making. And clearly you can't, right? You're seeing the impact, the outcome is catastrophic.
Yeah. And the trouble is everyone around him is trying to absorb all of the chunks from the outside world and deal as a kind of translation and simplification mechanism for him. And, kind of talking quite frankly, he's now over the age of 80. His ideological mental world is not as big as it was 8 years ago.
Yeah.
And so he's working on managing this mental representation of America that's in his mind. And it only has very loose connections with the reality of the American economy. And so you've got people, visibly leaping around like fleas in a flea circus, trying to take the things that he said and convert them into something that can be communicated to the outside world without causing a 10% fall in the US dollar.
That's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about technocracy, because you do, I mean, early in the book, you do seem to be laying a lot of blame at the feet of technocracy, and you kind of, you hinted at it then, because it's like, so many decisions have been taken out of the hands of the people.
Yeah.
And then you get this populist backlash where it's like a vote, against the elites, against the status quo.
Yeah.
And one of the things that stuck with me, I didn't realize this. So both the Maastricht Treaty 3% of GDP deficit number, you're not allowed a deficit over 3% of GDP in the EU.
Yeah.
And also the 2% inflation target that central banks across the world have. They're just like almost completely arbitrary. They just came from no, someone just said them, and now they're like the standard. And it's just like these technocratic decisions. They seem. I mean, is there any justification for this, or is it just as ridiculous as it sounds?
They seem like a good idea. For the history of the 3% number in the Maastricht Stability and Growth Pact is that it was inherited from the previous French fiscal regime, which had a 3% limit on the fiscal deficit. The French regime came from a conversation early in the Mitterrand government, where a civil servant called Guillabé was asked by the Treasury Minister to come up with a fiscal regime. And he actually gave an interview about how it happened when he was retiring. And he just said, well, the minister came in and said, I've got all these people coming into my office wanting to spend money. We need to have a limit on the deficit. I need you to give me a number that's good, sounds like it comes from an economist, and sounds convincing. And Abe kind of sort of looked up and said, well, there's no point in setting it any lower than 2, because 2 is what we've got at the moment. And, if we were going to say 5, then 5% of GDP feels like it's a bit high and won't constrain anything. But we're basically choosing between 3% and 4%. And he goes, well, 3 is a good number. It reminds me of the Holy Trinity. Lots of good things come in threes. Yeah. Let's say 3%. The whole discussion took an hour. And once that's in place, anyone who's going to change their mind is going to have to make a very, very visible decision. So, similar with the kind of inflation targets, it's pretty well accepted these days that 2% for the UK inflation target is probably the wrong number. Everyone who looks at this technologically goes, yeah, we kind of wish that we'd chosen 4 or even, 4.5% to 5% as a decent steady state rate of inflation. It would leave us that much more room for stimulus kind of at the lower bound. Why did we choose 2? Basically, we were copying New Zealanders. The New Zealanders were the first central bank to have an inflation target. Why did they choose 2? Because the Treasury Minister said on an offhand television interview that he thought he'd rather see it at 1%, and they reckon that they had a 1% measurement error, so they chose 2. And that was it. That was, again, the story of why it's 2%. But of course, everyone knows that if you move that inflation target from 2% to 4%, you're always going to go down in history as the guy who raised the inflation target. It's very, you're going to have to make that. There's no way to kind of secretly make that decision without it attaching to you. And of course, a bunch of people who bought bonds at the old price are going to lose money. So you're going to be in the very uncomfortable position of having a bunch of extremely rich people with a grudge against you and not really being able to pretend that it's anyone but you that they ought to have the grudge against. So these things just carry on, and here we are closer to 50 than 40 years from Guillaume's original decision, and 3% is still being debated in Europe as to whether that's the right number, and everyone kind of knows it isn't. And they're just now bolting on more and more escape clauses and just trying to erode the significance of that without anyone being prepared to bite the bullet and say the whole thing's gone. The whole Stability and Growth Pact is gone. It can't be saved.
I mean, it's so crazy that it from a decision-making standpoint, it was kind of easier to, let Greece burn and let all these horrible things happen in the EU than for somebody just to be like, no, the target's wrong based on some actual economics, which you could do. I'm changing it. Like, nobody was willing to do that. I mean, is that the 3%, the Maastricht Treaty? That's an accountability sink, right? Am I right that is? Yeah.
It was like nobody, the longest time. Firstly, if we go back to the start of where this came in, everyone wanted to be like the Germans. Everyone wanted to borrow German credibility. Everyone wanted to be perceived as being basically economically like the Germans. Then, the world kind of changed, and suddenly it became, everyone started going, oh yeah, if your economy is actually that of Greece, it's not such a great idea to have committed to being a bunch of ordoliberal anti-inflation cases. Of course, Germany was there going, there was no false advertising from the part of the Germans. It was part of the whole selling point of the thing that you were going to be in a currency union with a bunch of ordoliberal inflation eaters. But no one wanted to have that discussion of how you were going to create a currency which could incorporate these very different economies, what sort of fiscal transfers you would be needing. And then nobody liked the idea of having a big political meeting at which basically Germany and France sat down and decided what the budget was going to be for Greek pensioners. Because you were always going to end up with either a answer that was economically unsustainable for Greece, or you were going to end up with one that was politically unsustainable in Germany. And if you got something that was more politically unsustainable in Germany than what we actually had, the whole euro would have fallen apart. So everyone was just very happy to avoid all of those difficult decisions by saying, well, we solved all this 10 years ago. It's 3%. It's the Stability and Growth Pact. It's a magic number. You can't break that. What are you, crazy? It's a number.
So this does seem like a good entry point to talk about like what a good system might actually look like, right? And that's where the Stafford Beer and the Cybernetics come in. So, I mean, I don't know how much detail we necessarily want to go into with exactly what it looks like, but could you sketch like maybe some of the key principles that Beer thought made for a good decision-making system?
Yeah, I mean, high level, it is possible to go down a massive rabbit hole with these things. But high level, basically, cybernetics is just information theory applied to decision-making in organizational contexts. It's literally a lot of the same mathematics. There's Claude Shannon and all of the kind of information theory that you see in electrical engineering and telecoms, but applied in contexts where you can't necessarily quantify the number of megabytes per second, but you do know that the feedback connections are either there or there aren't. So the big principle of design is always making sure that there is sort of a cybernetic equivalent of accountability. And the cybernetic equivalent of accountability is that there has to be feedback from the consequences of a decision to the decision-making system. And a huge amount of what goes wrong in our economic and political system, in my view, is that those connections get broken, either because they are politically or organizationally inconvenient for someone, or because it looks like they are a waste of time and money because they're usually not doing anything, very important. You always kind of look at something like the emergency brake in a train and going like, well, I hardly ever use that. Let's get rid of it. So when you're designing a system, like the euro or like the Maastricht Stability and Control Pact, the decision process isn't finished when you've got what you think is the optimal design. The design process is only finished when you've also designed fail-safes and feedback mechanisms and arrangements to say how you are going to change this if you run into a situation in which it becomes unsustainable or damaging. And it's those fail-safes and feedback mechanisms that are just absent in a lot of mechanisms that have been designed specifically by economists in the neoclassical tradition, because economics in the neoclassical tradition tends to think mostly about perfect information and to think about equilibrium. And so it has this habit of designing systems with really nasty properties in out of equilibrium situations or in situations where the information is difficult or costly to communicate.
It's this idea of like levels of the system is quite key, right? And how each level has different roles, and it's a kind of the buck stops here. Is that was Harry Truman, was it? It's kind of, so I think system 5. So there are 5 systems for people who haven't read the book. Maybe we won't be able to explain them all in detail here, but like system 5 is like the buck stops here. System 5 is like the ultimate intervention. But system 2 similarly controls system 1 to a certain extent, and it's really interesting, right, how these systems interact, because you mentioned economists and their maximization stuff, and it does just strike me that they just don't acknowledge this at all, right? There's just the maximizing agents, and I guess sometimes in some models there's like a central bank, so there's maybe two systems in some models, but really this is all absent from their frameworks, right?
It's like obviously it's hard to generalize about economics because there's always someone doing something somewhere doing interesting work that it's not true of. But there's economic models seem to have this huge information reducing filter placed on every decision because every agent has got they face an information environment that's entirely made out of prices, and they make decisions that are almost entirely based on quantities. And so you've got this price and quantity. If you're doing really sophisticated game theory or sort of industrial modeling, you might have some kind of quality or product differentiations. Mostly you're dealing with completely undifferentiated goods. And if you're doing really complicated game theory of the sort that's almost impossible to derive any useful macro conclusions from at all, you might be able to cope with the fact that economic agents have ongoing repeated relationships with each other. If you actually kind of think about how pricing, production, and employment decisions are made in the world, the most complicated cutting-edge game theory model of how you might kind of set the pricing and output of a beer brand would be just a trivial problem that you'd give to a graduate student on the training program at ONDEV. The actual management of the economy by managers is just takes so many more things into account, because for the economists, they have this high-level philosophy that what they are doing is constrained optimization of basically a single quantity or something that can be reduced to a single quantity. And that hugely affects the kinds of things they can think about and the kinds of problems they can solve.
It's interesting because it's one of the things that you say is it's like economists are losing a lot of information, but in all the wrong places, right? So it's like, in one sense, they're making the problem too complex because you've got to optimize. So you've got to solve some constrained optimization problem, and those are very limited in what you can actually solve. And then so they have to drop everything from it and assume perfect information and so on. Whereas what you're talking about with the cybernetics seems like it's more of a, you said the feedback's like yes, no. It's not like optimization. It's more like, you get feedback or you don't, right? And those are the nodes you need to design. And you can imagine some kind of model. I don't know if it's necessary, but like some complexity model or something that, it's just a series of sort of like an electronic circuit, right? It's like and or, yes, no. And then the feedback continues up the path until there's a loop. And that's not as complex as optimization, but it is actually more realistic in a sense. Does that make sense, what I've said?
I think what you're describing there is the regulation by veto is an extremely useful kind of technique for building systems which have to deal with a lot of uncertainty and where you're not sure about how much bandwidth you need to build in at any point, because you just set up the system so that every unit in it, every kind of black box on the map, is capable of broadcasting to the whole system, this current arrangement is unacceptable to me. And then everything kind of changes and just, people grope around for other solutions until all of the boxes are sending the signal, this current arrangement is acceptable to me. And that's not necessarily going to be an optimum. There's a whole load of textbook maths about how close you might expect it to get to an optimum, and sometimes those arrangements can be pretty good. But it's not going to be an optimum, but it's always going to be an outcome that is acceptable to everyone in the system. The trouble being that you then get strategic behavior. You then get people, claiming that the outcome is unacceptable to them when it isn't. And dealing with that is one of the big kind of unsolved problems of politics, which is probably a bit above my pay grade. But it's better than having a system that just goes for constrained optimization of a couple of the parameters and then leaves out huge amounts of things that people care about.
Yeah, it's like, and it just reminds me again of this, like the fact that we don't have that. I'm not satisfied with the system, on a granular level. I'm not satisfied with my mobile phone provider. I'm not satisfied with the way the central bank's functioning. We don't have that on a granular level. This again is where you get this just massive backlash. It's just like, well, I reject the whole thing. That's all I've got now. I reject the whole thing.
It's absolutely, and that's what you see with Brexit. That's what you see with Trump. One of the things that kind of motivated me to start writing in this area is that there's no point of having a theory of Nigel Farage that has any Farage-specific characteristics to it. Your theory of Brexit has to work as a theory of Alliance for Deutschland and a theory of Trump and a theory of Modi, Erdogan.
Yes.
It's because all of these kind of leaders and political movements are so obviously similar that it's just not credible to say that we've had, 10 or 12 institution-specific, country-specific things happen that look really so similar and happen at exactly the same time.
So this idea of responsibility really interests me as well, because anyone who is at a higher level of the system has a responsibility to make a decision, right? And this is what we're lacking now. This is the unaccountability that we've spoken about. What I really think, what really interests me here is how this relates to economics, because I think bringing in the idea of responsibility, it's something that you won't really see that at all in economics. It's much more, there's like legal doctrine surrounding it, right? But it seems to actually, although cybernetics sounds kind of techie, I'd say this idea of responsibility is very human, right? And so you're really acknowledging something a bit more human in the way we design our systems here.
So it's just you have the decided upon, and there has to be some way to get their views into the rest of the system, because my own background is partly economics, but mainly business school, finance, and accountancy, and one of the things that really you begin to realize, as you spend a life dealing with accounts, is the amount of time you spend with a set of accounts trying to include information that's not in the accounting system. Because, an accounting system, like a set of economic statistics, like kind of anything that we kind of measure in that whole kind of area of our intellectual life, is defined by what information it includes and what information it leaves out. So a couple of years ago, I was involved with, I later left it, a project for bringing carbon accounting into financial accounting. And so basically bringing climate change risk and climate change factors into financial accounting, which was, it's a great project. There are still people doing it, working on it. I wish them well. But one of the things I thought as I was leaving that group was, isn't it kind of crazy that we've got an existential threat to human life on the planet Earth, and the only way that we can deal with it is by bringing it into a financial accounting system? It's like, shouldn't we be able to react on that information directly rather than by sort of arranging things so that it affected earnings per share? The reason that that's difficult is, firstly, a lot of carbon accounting and a lot of environmental factors just don't belong in a set of financial accounts, which are there to record financial transactions. But more importantly, we'd set up our whole corporate system of information and incentives so that it only responded to the information that was in the accounts. There was no way of getting people to respond to other important information because we'd set it up so that these things were set up to maximize profits and maximize shareholder value. And if you set up your system so that it's always ignoring certain kinds of information, then you better really, really hope that the information that you're ignoring is never going to be something that can damage the system.
Yeah, that's definitely not the case in that instance, right? I think, you know, this leads me to something that I been thinking about, which is like, it's quite hard to pigeonhole you politically and ideologically. Clearly, you know, you're not a Trump supporter. You're relatively progressive in your values and stuff, but you don't come across as like an overt socialist either. But I do have to say, throughout your book and this interview, you know, you've just been telling me time and time again where basically capitalism seems to conflict with the design of a good system. I mean, do you think that's true?
The kind of capitalism of the period since 1970, in fact, specifically since September the 13th, 1970, which was the date that Milton Friedman's essay, The Social Responsibility of a Company is to Increase Its Profits, was published. So, you know, politically, I'm always basically a J.K. Galbraith guy. You know, he's always been my intellectual hero. So I'm a Keynesian. You know, what's it that James Keynes said? When the class war comes, you will find me on the side of my own class, the civilized middle class. But, you know, it's the whole project of Keynesian has always been capitalism, but you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. You know, it's always been about organizing a broadly capitalist, broadly free market structure so that it doesn't generate reactive forces which will blow the whole thing apart. And Galbraith was very good and very interesting on that. But J.K. Galbraith operated in the US economy of the 1960s, which is an utterly alien intellectual landscape to us today. You could probably make a case in a blog post, probably. I wouldn't like to want to stand this up intellectually, but the US economy of the late 1950s probably has more in common with the Chinese economy of today than with the US economy of today, in terms of the way that it was managed and the way that it's interrelated with government, technology, science, and politics, rather than being completely based on financial reporting to owners of financial capital. You know, it's a very, very alien form of capitalism that is still people's mental model of what capitalism should be like. And we've, you know, since the 70s and 80s, developed this really weird, really obsessive, debt-financed, accounting-based, shareholder value-based version of capitalism in the Anglosphere economies and therefore across most of the world, which is, you know, in my view, just kind of genuinely unsurvivable. It's genuinely unsurvivable at a kind of planetary level. But also, you know, if you look at life expectancies in the United States of America, dealing with that kind of system seems to be increasingly individually unsurvivable for a lot of human beings.
I mean, would you say that you're someone who very much believes in like the power of ideas? You quoted Keynes once, then there's another quote about the power of ideas, right? Would you say you follow Keynes in that as well?
You know, it's the power of ideas, but not necessarily always the power of good ideas. Right. You know, the last kind of 50 years is really the story of Milton Friedman's version of capitalism winning, and that being very, very bad for everyone concerned.
Yeah, I mean that's fair enough. I think I go back and forth on this because I think somebody who was maybe more on the radical socialist side would argue that this kind of has to happen. This will happen. You know, Milton Friedman may be the main proselytizer, right? But like, it kind of had to happen because of crises of profitability and the general tendency for the capitalist class to accrue more power and kind of reorganize things in their image. And so that was kind of an inevitability. Neoliberal capitalism, maybe not the exact form, but something like it, was an inevitability for the US. I mean, do you disagree with that?
What we I would describe it is as the kind of the invisible class war. As what the kind of 1960s paternalist big company managed capitalism of J.K. Galbraith's era was a system that people were beginning to identify as managerialism, because you had what was, basically a free market economy, but the means of production were controlled basically by managers, by what Galbraith called the technostructure, but basically by specialists, administrators, who formed a class that went through business, government, and the army and just arranged things subject to fairly minimal oversight by investors, elected representatives, and kind of the sort of nominal elite. From the 1970s onward, you had a massive class war between the managers and the capital owners. And it was one in which the capital owners absolutely won. And they absolutely won by decimating the ranks of middle managers, massively culturally stigmatizing them. No one wants to be called a middle manager these days. And, at the end of this, we have this weird neoliberal, non-managerial capitalism where everyone is meant to be managing according to financial markets. For a lot of which was driven by people presuming that financial markets were the ultimate information processing system, that you could just throw any question and you would get an answer coming from the market about anything that you wanted to do.
So is that does that relate to the efficient markets hypothesis, would you say? Is that like the epitome of that?
Exactly. It's just this kind of belief that you can judge any policy from a government by looking at bond yields, and or you can, horrifically in the case of Boeing, you can make all of your judgments about the design of a new airliner by looking at the share price.
Yeah.
And the trouble is there again. It kind of comes back to cybernetics and information theory. The fact that a stall sensor is badly installed and needs a duplicate and will cause crashes just fundamentally isn't a piece of information about the stock market. It just fundamentally isn't a question that you can expect the equity market to answer for you. Similarly, the future of the European Union, you can't, it's just such a complicated thing that you can't expect a single number, which also has to do the job of clearing the savings and investments of the bond market, to give you all of that information.
I mean, you'd be talking about moving away from that. You'd be talking about some pretty serious institutional changes, right? You'd be talking about like completely different ways of like financing governments and maybe big restrictions on the amount of trading that you can do. Or is that the type of thing you'd have in mind?
Honestly, think that you could achieve a lot by getting rid of, I'll say getting rid of debt, and then I'll immediately qualify it by saying that there are some kind of situations in which companies and individuals do need to take out debt, etc., but hugely reducing, by which I mean rolling back probably the last 40 or 50 years worth of growth in the use of debt. Because most companies should be debt-free. Most organizations should basically be financing themselves from retained profits rather than borrowing loads of money. It should be hugely regulated, the extent to which you're able to take over a company using borrowed money. Weirdly, actually, since I've written the book, I've started appearing on all of the sports podcasts, because some of the people who are most interested in understanding what happens when you take over an entity with borrowed money and change its incentive structure are football fans. particularly Manchester United fans.
Yeah.
But, it's that whole practice of, the modern private equity industry as it is, just basically, I have friends who work in that industry, and I've said this to their faces. I think it's all bad. I think there's nothing that can be saved from it. In general, you probably don't need to do that much to the structure of government financing in the G7 industrialized nations. For emerging markets finance, I mean, I don't want to sound like some kind of mad sinophile here,
Right.
but we do have a very interesting model of the way in which China interacts with developing countries versus the way in which the Western Anglosphere capital markets interact with developing countries. And although I'm certainly not going to co-sign, or any reputation of the People's Republic of China and how it eventually ends up dealing with its African client states, I think everyone in those African governments would probably agree that they've had a better time dealing with China for the last 20 years than the time that they've had dealing with bond markets in the 20 years preceding that.
And what is this model? What's the key difference with this model?
It's basically non-market finance. It's you've got and there have been crises. I was born in Zambia, so I could follow the Zambian news every now and then, and so I'm kind of aware of this switch in the relationship there. Companies which run up big debts with PRC for development projects do get into trouble, and they do have debt crises with respect to their PRC debts in the same way that they used to with their bond market debts and with their IMF debts. The difference is, again, you've got a richer channel of communication because it is a state-to-state head of government to, well, not exactly head of government to head of government, realistically, but head of government to important guy in the finance ministry of the Republic of China. You can have richer communication and make longer-term binding deals than in a bond market system where really all you can do is set a price and a quantity, and you're left, when things get into trouble, you're left trying to negotiate with a very aggressive ad hoc committee of bondholders, generally run by bankers with much less skin in the game and much less commitment to any kind of longer-term relationship. So I kind of feel like it's significant changes, but not necessarily changes that would leave the whole system unrecognizable that are needed. But it's conscious management. It's like conscious understanding that when we're doing these things, particularly in the world of finance, we're talking about long-term projects. And so we've got to build institutions that are capable of making long-term decisions.
This is a pretty radical change. It's a very interesting idea. It's also completely in line with what you're talking about, right? Because it's, China is accountable, right, in a way that the market's not. The bond market's not really accountable. And that's something which just makes it extremely difficult for people to exert political will over the decisions of their governments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, obviously, if you say a phrase out loud like China is accountable, you're immediately vulnerable to the objection, which not be silly. But it has that feedback link in there. You can communicate with it in a way that you can't communicate with the bond market, and a way that you can't communicate with the European Central Bank. Because, all of these institutions were designed in many ways not to be communicated with, because they were designed because people felt like they'd had about enough of listening to input and feedback from the people who were bearing the consequences of their decisions.
Yeah, there's a kind of shush, we're calculating to it, isn't there? I think it's like, Yeah, it's really interesting. It does. You know, you talked about having a theory of everything. It does seem to bring a
It's,
lot of things together.
well, like any theory of everything, it's a theory of nothing because it doesn't work until you start building actual institutions.
Yeah.
But I've, the one thing I kind of want to say in the book is that all decision-making institutions are information processing institutions, and they have to be designed that way.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that the information balance sheet is going to balance in terms of the complexity of the environment with the capacity of the thing that's managing it. Otherwise you get a Donald Trump situation. If you have Donald Trump in power, then you have to reduce everything to a complexity that Donald Trump can deal with.
Yeah.
And then you have to work out how you're going to change his decisions into something that isn't going to blow the system apart. Because if you can't do that, then the system will become unregulated. And that's just, unfortunately, for those who are kind of stuck playing along at home, that's Theorem 9 from Claude Shannon's Theory of Information.
Theorem 9. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If anybody's got the theory of information open, then
yeah,
can cross-reference that.
Don't ask me for a page number or two.
Okay. No, actually, I really want to talk to you about Stafford Beer, the man, because I think there's a lot on. Well, there's a whole chapter on him, right? And he was an interesting guy, and you seem quite fascinated by him. So, could you kind of talk us through like how he came to this and what his main ideas were?
Well, like Stafford Beer, it's very interesting. Google image search will tell you a lot of Stafford Beer's biography because half the pictures of him are of a kind of big guy in a double-breasted suit with a cigar from his period as a management consultant, and then a lot of the rest of the pictures of him are much longer beard, flowing robes. He went from management guru to actual guru basically over the space of 15 years between 1965 and 1980. He was just this slightly, clearly incredibly intelligent, intuitive mathematician who was one of the few people who took Norbert Wiener's book Cybernetics, which was, the invention of information theory based on their war work on designing automated bomb sites and things like that. He was one of the few people who really understood that. And he started applying it to management problems, starting at a variety of British steel companies in the 1950s. Again, a whole different world. British steel companies were at that point the envy of the world. They were extremely well managed. He left one of the precursor companies to British Steel, worked in publishing for a while, set up his own management consultancy, but he was just generally kind of always trying to help companies organize themselves so that their internal communications would just respect the basic principles of information design and making sure that at every stage information was being represented which respected the compromise you need to make between the complexity of the world and the capacity of the management team to deal with it. Kind of the sort of things that he did. He kept on writing books, kind of detailing how you would put this kind of framework into practice. And he was just kind of getting to the height of his powers. And it would have been really interesting to see how he dealt with the 1970s and the widespread availability of electronic computing in corporate settings. But then Chile happened. And what happened in Chile is that he was called up by some Chilean engineers who had been recruited into the economics ministry of the Allende government and asked to come over and help them build, a new economic form of organization. And this was, just the most exciting kind of project of his life. He went over to do this, and they were starting to create a network for running the national industries of Chile. It's like a lot of people kind of have preferred to pretend that they were trying to make Soviet planning work with computers, which absolutely wasn't what they were trying to do. They were trying to introduce a communication network that would delegate authority down to the lowest level where the problem could be solved, then provide a kind of feedback network so that issues as they arose on the factory floor or at the industry level would be escalated to the central government to be solved as they arose. And, it looked like a fascinating experiment. Obviously, then they had the Pinochet coup in 1973, so it never really even got a chance to fail. But that was the story of Stafford Beer, and that completely derailed his career in management science. From then on in, he spent 3 or 4 years trying to ensure the physical safety of the Chileans who'd worked with him. And then he started going into philosophy and writing really kind of strange and incredibly interesting textbooks that it's like half kind of yoga and meditation, and then every now and then you'll get a chapter that is nothing but equations because he feels like it's necessary to do some stochastic control theory in order to understand the next bit of right. So it's a real rabbit hole. His books are quite expensive, so only get them if you see them in a charity shop. But there's always some really interesting stuff in there.
I mean, with Chile, I think I was wondering if you could speak to it a bit more, because like Cybersyn, it was called Cybersyn, right? That's like the one a lot of people talk about. A lot of people ask me about like what I think of Cybersyn, and I suppose in one sense there's not too much to say because it never really got off the ground, and it was literally sort of bombed or whatever. But I mean, do you think does it seem like it was a good attempt at an implementation of the principles that we've been talking about?
In a sense, the big thing about it is that it was an attempt to impose an economy-wide system of management by exceptions.
Yeah.
So it really was absolutely meant to implement the principle of delegating everything to the lowest possible level, because of course the lowest possible level of decision making is the one that's in closest contact with the reality on the ground.
Yeah.
So it was an idea that would actually hopefully dispense with systematically connected government statistics and replace financial accounting, because you would no longer be attempting to collect all of the information about production and centralize it in one place. The idea was that all the problems should be dealt with at the level where they happened. That meant, ironically, that there was a control room, and the control room is the one that you can see pictures of on the internet. It looks like Star Wars. There was apparently considerable design influence from Star Trek, but unlike Star Trek, the chairs have got ashtrays in the arms.
Okay.
But the control room was in many ways misnamed. It was meant to be the central problem-solving room, and it would be a room where you brought various kinds of technical experts to deal with problems that had been elevated all the way up to the centre because they couldn't be solved at the shop floor or the regional levels and required kind of action from central government. I think that's quite an attractive model for all sorts of organisations. There are plenty of companies that work like that. I was lucky enough to work at a couple of investment banks that pretty much worked exactly like that, in that we had a partners committee that met every week purely to discuss problems that had been elevated because they couldn't be solved anywhere lower down in the bank. And, could you run a country like that? I think yes. could you run a country in Chile's specific situation, which is to say, one of the big targets of the USA during the Cold War, with a mining industry, with a very substantial reactionary kind of movement, and with a computer network that basically consisted of 400 telex machines? It didn't feel like it was getting a fair shot. But I think that, Idin Medina's book on Cybersyn is fantastic. I think she takes a much more cynical view of it than I did after reading her book. I think it really could have got somewhere.
Yeah, it's that, just like that progressive escalation, right? This is what we're talking about. It's like a problem on the shop floor gets escalated to the managers, and then most of the time the managers can solve it, right? And then, but then if they can't, they escalate it to the next level. So you've got like, only 1/1000th of all problems that come on the shop floor are going to end up at the highest level, right? And so you just end up like, with only the most powerful decision makers are given the most unsolvable, the most important problems. And it's such a sensible idea. I mean, you said you've seen it in business. Is there any other case, like countrywide or a bigger level than business, where you've seen something like it?
Not really so much. I suppose, my own experience is all in banking. And weirdly, the central banks of the world have a club that works quite like this for their organisation. You have the Bank for International Settlements, which is the BIS. The international settlements in question are German First World War reparations. You might wonder, why is a bank that was meant to facilitate German reparations for the First World War still around in 2025? And the answer is that it just proved to be very convenient. The First World War reparations of Germany involved substantial transfers of gold and loans between central banks. And so they had this little club where they always met in Basel. And over time, it just became extremely useful for them to keep on meeting there. And big problems like the 1980s Latin American debt crisis, like the rise of Japanese banks financed by domestic real estate gains, taking an oversized international role in the 1990s, like the global financial crisis of 2008. All of these things ended up being escalated to the BIS in Basel, where you have the Mark Carneys and Andrew Baileys of the world just really sitting down in a room and thrashing the problems out. It's a very interesting, strange organization, and it's very dependent on quite close personal ties and ideological simpatico between central bankers. But there are a lot of things, particularly in the global payment system, that have just got worked out there. And in many ways, it is sort of a model that everyone in the world who runs a central bank is meant to take care of their own garden. But when there's things which they find can't be dealt with one by one, they all get together in a little club to sort it out in Basel.
Yeah, okay. Well, that seems like it's a sensible part of central bank policy, right? We've been talking about some unsensible parts of it, but it definitely seems to make sense. I've got to ask you about central planning, because about half of my audience, for some reason, seem to like central planning, despite its obvious failure. How does it relate to your framework, this framework in particular, would you say?
Well, the thing is, there's two problems with central planning, which is that it's planning and that it's central. And the problem with planning is always getting the information to where it can be processed, turned into a decision, and sort of sent back out into the world quick enough to be able to respond to the system, to the changes. And that is a technological problem, but it's also an accounting problem. Whenever you're trying to deal with central planning, you're always putting that information reducing filter onto things, because all of the reality of the world has to be compressed down to a model of the world that the central planning authority can deal with. And that is, to my mind, it has almost all of the problems of financial capitalism, plus a few more, because once more, you are just washing everything down into a reporting system, which involves throwing away a huge amount of information, but then you are usually processing it in a much kind of smaller information processing system, even than the financial markets, which I've already said I don't think are adequate to the task. What you need is something that's more like a decentralized planning system, where you just have what Stafford Beer called the resource bargain, where every economic entity gets given effectively a budget and told you can do what you like as long as you do not make excessive demands on the rest of the system. And some of those demands might be in terms of resources that you require, but also you might say you have a budget in terms of the amount of input from central government that you are allowed to take up, the amount of political unrest and local opposition you are allowed to create, and just setting that kind of bargain of the resources that entirely decentralized kind of planning units can make, and then dealing with exceptions to that, and then having a central planning system being more of a central dispute reconciliation system whenever those bargains need to be renegotiated, or whenever kind of resources need to be transferred from one unit to another. So, yeah, I can see something much more democratic than a market system working, but I don't think it would look anything like any of the examples of central planning that we have. And I specifically, if we're going to kind of fire some shots here, don't think it would look like the kind of linear programming supercomputer that Paul Cockshott thinks is viable, or any artificial intelligence powered version of same.
Yeah, I mean, is this abstraction from reality, and you are going to simplify some elements of it, and the problem is very difficult to solve as well. There's some people who think that maybe that can be done with modern computing techniques, but I don't think you're getting away from the fact that you're fundamentally turning something into a model. With central planning, and any model will abstract from reality, and then the bigger the model, the bigger the plan, the more authority the planner has imposing this model, then the more absurd some of the outcomes are going to be when you realize that you haven't matched onto the nitty gritty of the real economy, of real everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, if you're building the central planning system, as I keep on saying, you've also got to build a central feedback system. You've also got to build some kind of system for carrying information right back up from the population in exactly as much resolution as you're doing the planning, in order to make sure that you're not having one of the reasons that the market system has worked so well is that there's always the ability of a customer to transmit one bit of information by refusing to buy something. And you can, in a kind of old-fashioned sort of Soviet system, you don't even have that single bit of information that's going up there.
I think there's sometimes a bit of a conflation between planning and central planning, isn't there? Because what you're describing that you'd like to see is quite clearly a system of planning. There is a plan, and it's kind of central, right? But the point is that it doesn't include everything. There's decentralized elements to it, substantial decentralized, and there's feedback. Whereas I think with some of the central, especially 20th century central planning, it's like, this is what we're going to do to you, and that's it. Right, so there's nothing that we're talking about that we need here.
And almost all of those 20th century planning systems were designed at a time where it was clearly technologically impossible to have any of that feedback in there. So they were always, they were, we can see with the benefit of hindsight that this was creating a system that was bound to be fragile because it was incapable of responding to its environment.
Yeah. It was created at a time when it was even worse than it would have been now, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask you. So I'm at the stage of the interview where I'm asking about all the buzz topics, all the buzzwords. But you have been contributing to Crooked Timber, which is the oldest blog in the world, as far as I'm concerned. It's been going for ages. So I know that you know Henry Farrell and Cosmos Shalizi, right? Now, they've been doing a lot of interesting stuff on artificial intelligence. And they basically, their argument is that artificial intelligence, well, actually, no, let me rephrase that. Their argument is that markets are already a kind of artificial intelligence, right? They're already a sort of social feedback loop. And artificial intelligence, it's a misnomer. We all know that. But what it does is it takes what we know statistically, kind of averages it and spits out like some kind of normalized version of what we know, right? But they say that markets kind of do this as well. Now, I don't know. This feels like it links to your book. This is a very vague question. I don't know how. Does it link to your book?
No, I do know Henry and Cosmo. Henry actually gave me some very useful comments on the draft of the book. And it's a very kind of information theory, cybernetics way of thinking about these things. And artificial intelligence is a horrible word because we have so many connotations to the word intelligence. But it is a decision-making system. So you can have a computer and the decisions it makes, they're real decisions. They can turn you down for car insurance. Like a artificial intelligence kind of an AI program, markets will take in information of various sorts and they will output decisions of various sorts. So if you think about it purely as a black box, they are doing the same kind of thing, and you can tune the computer to maybe have different priorities or spit out different kinds of decisions. On the other hand, the market, unlike the computer, is capable of searching out different forms of information. So they're different kinds of decision-making systems. But these are decision-making systems, and a market will take in information and put out and have outputs and is capable of accepting feedback in exactly the same way as the computer system can be. So I'm totally on board with that.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I guess it really reframed how I think about AI. I mean, could you see a role for that? Because you called it, your system 4 is intelligence, right? You call it intelligence. Could you see a role for this, modern, what we call AI in these kinds of systems? Do you think they would massively improve it?
The whole history of organization is that the world gets more complicated at a multiplicative rate, basically exponentially. Because as you add more things, the number of connections between things grows multiplicatively. Your ability to manage that complexity grows basically linearly. You add more management, you add more resources. This means that over time, the gap between the complexity of the world and the capacity to manage it reaches crisis point. Something becomes unmanageable, and we have to reorganize. And if you take something like Alfred Chandler's kind of books on the history of management, this is an absolute constant. This is what companies do. Things get too complicated for them, they reorganize, and that reorganization has always involved a form of devolution. So the central management gives up on trying to administer at a particular level of detail and delegates things down to subsidiaries or multi-divisional companies and so on. Within that linear growth of the capability of management, we have occasional step jumps up with technological revolutions. So, like things like writing or double entry bookkeeping. I have this kind of fantastic kind of example that me and Henry both try to use in talks, which is that in its day, even the humble filing cabinet was a big jump in information technology. It made the railroads possible in many ways. What we've got here with your modern generative AI systems is something that really looks like a technological leap that could buy us a bit of time to work out how we are going to reorganize our economy and society, because we really need to. The issue is, how do we use that? There is this Stafford Beer joke that I try to get into every presentation I do, which refers to his experience as a consultant at the end of the 1960s when corporations were just installing IBM mainframes. This was something they could have used to completely revolutionize the way that they tracked information from marketing to production to kind of customer relationships and feedback. There was a lot they could have done, but in fact, it would have been politically and organizationally difficult. It would have put too much pressure on their existing management relationships. It would have disrupted existing hierarchies. So what they generally did was install the mainframe and used it to automate their payroll, or used it to automate the production of their quarterly accounts. As Stafford Beer said at the time, it was like being given the chance to hire Galileo, Einstein, and Mozart, and then put them in a room memorizing phone numbers so that you could, memorizing the phone book so you could look things up more quickly. We've got, with generative AI, something that's clearly capable of doing very surprising things in terms of summarizing huge amounts of information and giving a different kind of access to huge amounts of training data. And it looks like we're going to use it to send more emails. It feels like a terrible waste of capacity. So, I think the answer to your question, Lengo, is yes, I think it could. I think the way that we currently seem to be gravitating towards using it could be really, a massively wasted opportunity.
And I mean, you could go further than that, right? Because it seems like in some cases AI might be used as an accountability sink, right? If you're just like, if it's being used for certain decisions and you say, well, this is just like this is what the market said, this is what the AI said, and then
no. Some policymakers are very alert to that. The last AI Act from the European Union basically put in place what they called a right of explainability. So to say that if any decision affecting your life is made by a machine system, then you have a right to ask, to have that decision explained to you, and effectively kind of regulating the way, the building of such systems so that you can't build one in such a way that it can't give human relevant explanations. Which I thought was a really good kind of step against something that would really obviously be a kind of tactic open to abuse by corporations. I did manage to irritate my friend at the European Commission, though, because when the Explainability Act came out, I pointed out that it had come from the European Commission, and then I asked, when you make a decision that affects people, what right of explainability do they have from you? And the answer was something along the lines of stop trying to be clever.
Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, the EU, designing explainability criteria for AI systems, but not for themselves. That seems like a good place to round the conversation off, because we've kind of come full circle. I think it's really interesting. I actually, there is one final example that I wrote down, but I haven't said anything to you. But I think a good example of this sort of rejection of the lack of accountability and this, I don't like what's going on, is of course Luigi Mangione and Brian Thompson. And that happened since your book came out. I'm not trying to get you into trouble here, but what do you make of that? Because that occurred to me as an example.
Yeah. I mean, I was at the conference in where was it, Baltimore, when that news hit, and I kind of had about like 5 or 6 different text messages coming on because I'd written something earlier that, when you shut down all other forms of feedback, you've a really restricted communication channel. The only message that channel can carry is a screen. And I'd actually written that in the context of Trump's election. And 6 or 7 people sort of started throwing that quote back at me and linking to this headline. Yeah. And I was thinking, what if there's an opportunity to get myself in so much trouble? There was sort of, not to condone any activity, and violence is never a solution to anything, but this kind of thing did not used to happen. Yeah. Chief executives did not used to need the degree of security that they have.
Yeah.
Part of the problem here is that there is no way to communicate with companies in general. Insurance companies have a particularly bad reputation and track record for being difficult to communicate with.
Yes.
American health insurance companies more than anyone else. It's hoping that things like this don't become commonplace, because I do kind of like living in a society where you can walk down the street and there aren't armed guards everywhere.
Yeah.
But it's a sign of the kind of world that we're living in, that lots of places have security where what they actually need is communication.
Yeah.
People need to be listened to. That's one of the obvious explanations for the incredible popularity of chatbots and AI. Not feeling listened to is one of the big issues of our age. And as anyone who's brought up a toddler or been in a bad relationship knows, feeling like you're not being listened to is one of the most psychologically intolerable things on earth.
Yeah, that's very, very true. And I mean, the other thing about it is that it doesn't, despite the act, probably doesn't make a difference to, I don't know, like it doesn't, the CEO, you talk about this, you say, not when you shoot the CEO, but even if you manage to get the CEO on the phone, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything either. So it's like, it's an act that doesn't actually result in any kind of improved outcome, but it's just predictable, right? It's predictable.
Well, that is actually the other thing that is not necessarily emphasized by the people who kind of hero worship Luigi Mangione, which is, what major changes in policy with respect even to that health company actually affected. So, I'm saying there are no other forms of effective communication, but going out and assassinating the CEO is also not an effective form of communication either, because the organization is the organization. It's the system, not the human being.
Yeah. You need absolutely radical overhauls of the system to make it work for people, so they feel listened to and they are listened to as well, and there are changes. I mean, thanks so much for coming. So the Unaccountability Machine is great. It's such a great book, and I think, again, I said this at the start, cybernetics, the ideas of Stafford Beer, all of this stuff, it's time has come, I feel. It's like we really need to be talking about this.
I kind of feel hopeful that more people are using the phrase, the purpose of a system is what it does. And if 1 in 100 of those starts kind of looking onto the internet to say that's an interesting phrase, I wonder who first said it, they will end up going down the Stafford Beer rabbit hole.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the purpose of a system is what it does. That should be household. Everyone should be saying that. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Dan. See you later.
I'll see you around. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.